Some years ago, when I began attending university far away from home in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, I began to feel a sense of anxiety. Not sure where it came from. I couldn't even figure out what to attach it to. I just knew it was there. And I think I had some loving relatives, my aunt and uncle, who knew it was there too. And so they began to invite me to their home every Sunday evening for supper. That's that meal that you have around 6 o'clock. I'm not sure what you call it. We called it supper. And I always remember at the end of that meal, we celebrated with a Saskatoon berry pie with a crumble topping. Delicious, delicious pie. But that became a ritual for me. It was a touchstone in my week. No matter how anxious I felt, I knew that I would be held in the loving embrace of family every Sunday night. Maybe that's what propelled me to having a Sunday practice again. You know, that practice of coming to worship with all of you every Sunday morning and being held in the loving embrace of community. You know, I know that we as humans are shaped by a greater degree than any other species by our living in contact with one another. Modern anthropology and neuroscience tells us that cooperation and group identity, a sense of fair play, are defining characteristics of the human experience. You know, and for 99% of human history, we lived together in bands of hunter-gatherers where an egalitarian ethos predominated. We're a species of exceptional altruism and empathy that seems to be innate. You know, I witnessed my 3-year-old son, Baird, and his desire to share what he has with others. And, you know, I'd like to think that, he learns that from his mom and dad, you know, watching how we are. But I think that it just is innate within him and within all of us that we have a sense of altruism embedded in who we are as human beings. And we need that social interaction. And yet I sometimes hear us telling ourselves these stories about how as humans we're selfish and greedy and grasping, and we shove each other out of the way all the time. And yet we know that's a mythology, but if we tell ourselves that long enough, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we know that we're better than any other species at being cooperative. And yet researchers are raising the alarm that currently we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic. And I'm deeply concerned that we are becoming a lonely planet. This loneliness epidemic is particularly troublesome amongst younger people and our elders. They're warning us that social isolation is leading to this loneliness, and in fact, it is deadly. Smoking and obesity, dementia, high blood pressure, substance abuse, accidents, depression, anxiety, and suicide are more prevalent when we become disconnected from each other. Yeah, we might think that, isn't social media doing something about that? Like, don't we look at our Facebook feeds and say, wow, I've got so many friends. And yet we know that can be an illusion, that it doesn't provide us with a deep sense of connectedness with each other. I believe that our faith calls us to act against this impulse to think that we should be competitive and individualistic. For the most social creatures who cannot prosper without love, there is now no such thing as society. That we need to stand against that sense that the only thing that counts is winning and the rest is collateral damage. I believe that it is a religious community like this that we resist that way of thinking. That we not only resist it, that we build together by experimenting together in creating the world we dream of, the world that we dream of living in. This is a place where we strengthen those connections and we engage in a practice of being faithful to each other. Faithful to each other.
I am very glad to be in this pulpit today. Although I enjoy my summer away and the times that I get renewal and rest, I have missed being with you because you, as my community, are part of my reality test. And is there anyone out there getting up in the morning, reading the headlines and getting all that information flooding at you that sometimes needs a reality test? Anyone out there? Yeah. Okay. So the president pardons former Arizona Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and all of a sudden, in my reality, I'm back walking through those rusty bunks and the World War II era canvas because I visited that jail on a private tour in 2012 when our General Assembly was in Phoenix to witness against that evil. And I see, as I hear that story, those desperate eyes and the pleading words of the men that he housed in bunks outside in triple-digit temperatures like the ones we just had, with very inadequate water. I'm there again, and I feel that fear again, like I know that other stories in the news are making all of us sometimes seize up as we hear something that we've really feared happening again. This man, this braggart, was pardoned with his cruel treatment of undocumented people under his care, whose demeanor and swagger spoke of a dangerous ego which was divorced from a basic sense of embracing the humanity of the other. In the world that I want to live in, a world of facts and logical consequences, this shouldn't happen. This shouldn't be. But it is. Anyone else need a reality test? Yeah. So in the last weeks, we have heard 2 executive orders. One takes away the right of transgender individuals to serve in our military, something that we are very short of, people willing to serve in our military. And I think back on the people that I know and love and realize that a high percentage of them are actually veterans. They're actually people that served in our military. And all of a sudden they're being told that they may not serve because who they are is not okay. This shouldn't happen, and yet it did. And then this week we get the executive order that many of us have been dreading also, rescinding deferred action for childhood arrivals, known as DACA. And I think about the DACA recipients who've stood in this pulpit and thanked us for their support over the years. And I think of the young woman who sat with me just a few months ago in our own sheriff's, David Livingston's office, to say that his support of this administration created huge fear in her family, and her community. In the world in which we all work, this shouldn't happen. But it did. So I'm glad to see all of you. Glad to see all of you, because almost a half a century after the civil rights movement and the stands at Stonewall, we are a nation even more divided by difference, it seems, all of a sudden. And what's odd about it is the facts and the figures don't add up. The polls show that most people believe that we should behave with respect and inclusion towards one another, and yet we don't. Meanwhile, we wake every day, as I said, to images and to new policies that take away the rights of our neighbors and also give us a whole nother role in the world than the one that we are used to having. It is a time of great difficulty for us, and amidst all of this, we still face the truth of natural occurrences, which are happening more and more, forces of nature unleashed on our national and global neighbors, and our policymakers denying the scientific research about changes in our climate and blocking those actions we could take and those preparations we could make. And we still, as human beings, face those truths of human existence, that people we love will die and get sick, that people don't always behave the way we would want them to act. To face all of this alone would be unspeakable. But the good news is that we don't have to face it alone. This unfunny, fun house of a world we're living in walks many of us to those edges today, the ones that Neal just mentioned in his reflection. I talk to people every week who are at that point of deep despair, or who are struggling with addiction, who are struggling with some kind of unhealthy way of trying to turn off the world around them. Our technologies have surpassed our technologies of relating and of true knowledge. And Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who is the retired chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, says, "We are living so close to difference with such powers of destruction at our hand." And what I want to say to you today is, in this world, it matters that we are a community of faith. Now, I know there are some among you that are thinking, oh no, not that too. Now we have to talk about faith. I don't like faith. I don't like that idea. I walked away from that. Radio show talk host Krista Tippett says that many have experienced the religion of their childhood as a series of failures towards unreachable moral perfectionism, when what faith actually is supposed to be about is the power of moral imagination. And it's that moral imagination that we need so desperately in these times, when actually we don't have the technical solutions to many of the problems about how we can live together across such great challenges and such great differences. Faith doesn't mean something that we no longer want to have. It means being willing to engage in who we are and being willing to bring what religion has brought to our public debate for all the centuries of our nation, which is that far horizon of hope, that belief that even though we may not see the way in front of us now, that way is still important to move towards, step by step, inch by inch, in whatever ways we can. Religions are on a drastic decline in this nation. And one thing I think is important for us to realize is that while the religious right was a small part of what happened as in the sea change of perspective in our nation, the alt-right at its core is not a religious movement. It is a secular movement based on the right of people to have their rights unimpinged and the freedom to do what they want to use to get their individual wants. Religions transmit core values, the values that we need to navigate this puzzle box of a time: respect for common humanity, love, and a recognition of our interdependence. Our culture is insidious. All of these little devices and screens that we see all our day are teaching us messages. They have become, in many ways, our great teachers of values. And the values that they're teaching folks are not the values that are the ones that we wish to have. in our life. They're teaching us to commodify everything, to put a price tag on everything. One of the things that Joe Arpaio used to have that I remember most distinctly from my very fear-filled visit into his jail was that he hung on the side of his jail, on the big concrete wall at the front, this giant sign that was a parody of those old McDonald's signs. Does anyone remember them that said, in my youth, they said 150 billion served, right? They listed, and the little numbers would change, remember, as the more burgers were sold. So he had one of those signs, and it was the number of people he had imprisoned. And he would brag about that and show every visitor that sign. For him, the people in his jails were just notches on his scorecard. So we're being taught to fear everyone. And fear and hate is contagious. We can do so much good if we think about, as Neal said, countering those values with the values of this place as a laboratory where we learn what it means to be with people who we do not always agree with, but whom we are willing to stay in deep dialogue with despite our disagreements. Because there is a huge divide among us, but there is also that far horizon that we all embrace. It is very important for us to think about this and to think about how we build this community, not only with our time and also with our effort to make it the best it can be. This is the time of the year when we need to reach out and fill those jobs that make it possible for this place to go forward. And I will tell you that this year it has been harder to fill them than ever before. We are not immune from the trend that is sweeping our entire nation, where people are turning inward, wanting to do less and less in the world, and wanting to have more of their time for themselves. It's important because they're fearful of connection. It's important to think about how you will support the mission of this place, whether you're on the streets or behind the book sale table. Consider saying yes when one of us calls to bug you, because we're going to be calling, right, Neal? We can't just pull away and hunker down because times are frightening. The kind of hurricane we are facing in our society requires us to stay engaged and aware. I've talked to so many of you over this last year when we feel like we always need a reality test from one another. And one of the things I've heard over and over and over and over and over again is that the most heartbreak that many people feel is that this is the world that we may be leaving to those who come after us. I know within this room right now, there are decades represented of people who have fought to have a fairer and better world, and yet all of a sudden it seems as if it's swept away. And in this time, our children need us to equip them, not just with empty ideals or functionless facts, but they need the tools of faith in this world. They need to understand the power of hope and the resistance of gratitude. They need to understand the importance of humility and the openness to the unknowing that we're all invited into right now. Krista Tippett says that our kids want us to finally get this right. They have injected the language of transparency and authenticity and integrity into our civic vocabulary, our youth, our children, our young adults. They have introduced terms we do not like. They have asked us to wrestle with their anger about the world we are leaving them. And we need to learn how to have the courage to listen. Civil rights activist Reverend James Barber is leading something called the Moral Monday movement. And it's one of those places where we're seeing faith reimagined and changing the landscape in a state, North Carolina, which once was one of the most progressive southern states and whose policies were suddenly swept, as our nations were, back into a very hate-dominated frame. He talks about a decision he made to move from his base of power in the middle of the state to answer a call to go to the western part of the state. The demographics in that state are such that the African American population is largely in the east, and the west is largely an all-white population. And this is what he says. I remember from my time as chair of the Human Relations Commission that Mitchell County, where I was called, was one of the places I've been told never to drive at night. Back in the 1920s, after a black man was accused of rape in that part of the state, the people in that county put all the black folk on one train and shipped them out of Mitchell County. Now, I believe in fusion politics, but this sounded like a suicide mission. So I told our strategist, Tim, that we had a plan for next month and we better just stick to that. But not long after, the phone rang, and it was the Reverend Vernon Tyson. He's about 80 years old and a stalwart supporter of the movement, and he started talking in a way that only an old Southern gentleman can. Reverend Barber, I hear that you don't want to go to Mitchell County, and I understand. But I've been preaching this gospel a whole long time, brother. I preached it in the Methodist church before that I knew they were run by the Klan. And I know how hard it can be, Reverend. So I'm calling to let you know that I'm going to be going with you when you go to Mitchell County. Well, Reverend Barber knew when he had been told. So he packed up and he went. And he said when he got to the church, it was packed with white folks. He talked for an hour. They all sat there very quietly. And he thought, oh boy. But right after that, they opened it up for questions, and this is what he says. When I was done, a woman stood up and said, Reverend Barber, we want you to know that we've been driving all the way down, which is about a 5-hour drive, to Moral Mondays and watching what's going on. We're old Eisenhower Republicans, and we know the Tea Party doesn't represent us. And then the former head of the county's Republican Party stood up and said he had just resigned that last night because of extremists who had taken over the party that he loved. And then another man stood up and said he just started a chapter of the NAACP in that county because even though he wasn't sure there were any black people, he thought they should have a chapter. I almost fell out of my seat, Reverend Barber said. What he captures in this moment is the fact that it was his faithfulness that brought him to that county. It was his faithfulness that allowed him to stand there not knowing what on earth he was going to say to those people and what they were going to say to him. But he did it. The black church has been a teacher for me for many decades because it's the lived expression of a people who know what it means to make a way out of no way. Now, some of us have been doing that for a while, and others are waking up every day now and saying, yep, no way, so it's time to make a way. To do this, we're going to have to engage in some enterprises together, some of which will be painful. We're going to have to listen to each other and realize that our truths and what's happening are different, and that we have different ways of saying what we know, and that we have different ways of feeling what's happening, and that some of us are truly driven to despair by listening to what's happening, and we're vulnerable and angry. This struggle is going to involve humility, another classic virtue, and also patience. And there's certain kind of belief, our belief, which says that we need to stay in the struggle even when we don't see the way. I believe this is a time when we can use the lens of Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer, which says, God, grant us the serenity to accept the things that can't be changed, the courage to change the things that can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We can't give our youth and young adults a different world. We can use our last breaths and energy to do every little thing that we can do. We can't stop a Category 3 storm or a raging flood, but we can give to our own Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which works with folks on the ground to reach those who are often left unassisted by mainstream rescue efforts. We can't understand all the time why people are so angry among us, why our own people of color, why our own young adults are asking us to wrestle with concepts that don't make sense to us from our frame, but we can continue to listen and be in dialogue. We can't stop the politics of hate single-handedly, but we can stand up and speak up and claim our truths as people of faith who know what should be and know that this ain't it. And we can practice here in this community, treating one another with respect and difference and dignity so that we can engage in real conversations and not take our differences underground, because it is taking our differences underground that led us to the world in which we live. Unitarian Universalist chaplain Kate Braystrap says this: "The question isn't whether we're going to have to do hard and awful things, because we are. The question is whether we have to do them alone." We don't have to do them alone, friends. The good news is we don't have to do them alone if we choose to make the commitments to do them together. My great far horizon is that we will be the people of the courageous imagining who can still keep that dream of a world where all are respected and loved alive, who might see that the path to it is a little different than what we thought it was, but who will give those who come after us and those who are so frightened among us today the tools they need to navigate it, who would take what coulda, shoulda, oughta be and make it real in our world, and in some part, do our little part to make this nation truly great again, to make our own lives feel transformed, to make our own places and towns feel safe again for all. It will take some work. We're going to have to struggle through some of it, but may we be the ones bold enough and brave enough to offer ourselves as people of faith to a hard and hungry world. And may we be the ones to make it so. Thank you.